Classic Country 100.1 WGLC. Good morning. It's Music and Stuff. Joining me on the phone is Gary K. Wolf, author extraordinaire, who's done quite a few projects throughout his long and illustrious career, but he started way back in Earlville, Illinois. Good morning, Gary.
Hey, Charles. How you doing? Good to be back here in the heartland.
Now, to give some background for listeners who may not know, you grew up in Earlville. You graduated Earlville High School in 1959 with a future Archbishop, John J. Myers.
We were best friends, believe it or not.
And became known internationally for creating an amazing universe full of cartoon characters and then some. Now, you've told the story before about coloring in school and how your creativity was led to a love of science fiction. How did that all start?
I was in the third grade there in Earlville, Illinois, and my third grade teacher gave us a picture to color, and the whole premise of the assignment was to stay inside the lines. Just color it inside the lines. I was better at staying inside the lines than anybody, and I said, "Whoa, I am. This is right down my alley." So I'm looking at the picture, and the picture was, a typical Illinois farm scene. There was a farmhouse, there was a barn, there was a pasture, and there was one cow all by itself out there in the middle of the pasture. So I picked up my crayons and I colored the house yellow because that was the color my house was, and I colored the barn red because that's the color barns are. And I'm looking at that cow, and my mother, Hattie Wolf, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners probably know or knew and remember. My mother Hattie used to always tell me that when people were all by themselves, they got sad and lonely and they got blue. So I looked at that picture and I colored that cow blue. So I handed my paper in, and the next day the teacher passed back all the papers except for mine. And she said, "Gary," she said, "would you come up here to the front of the room?" I went up and I said, "Oh my God, I stayed inside the lines better than anybody." So I went up to the front of the room and she said, "Now you face the class." I faced the class. She held that picture up over my head and she said, "Class, look at this stupid picture. Everybody knows that cows are brown, cows are white, cows are black. Sometimes cows are brown, black, and white, all three, but never are cows blue." And she told me, she says, "Gary, don't ever do that again." She called my mother, and my mother had to go to school. And the teacher said to my mother, "I think there's something wrong with Gary. He colored a cow blue." So my mother and dad, Hattie and Ed, called me into the living room after school that day. And my mother said, "Gary, why did you do that?" And I said, "Ma, it was you. You told me, people sad and lonely all alone. Blue, cow sad and lonely all alone. I colored the cow blue." She said, "Well, Gary, you go outside and play. Your dad and I have to talk about this." Now, my folks were not what we would call today upscale urban intellectuals. I mean, my mother had to drop out of school in the 8th grade to go to work during the Depression. My dad had to drop out of school in the 3rd grade to go to work during the Depression to support his family. I didn't think this was going to have a happy ending. Well, they called me back in after about 15, 20 minutes, and my mother said to me, she says, "Gary, your father and I talked about this, and we decided the next time you want to color a cow blue, you go ahead and color a cow blue." I got to tell you, that was the best piece of advice I've gotten in my life. I've colored a lot of cows blue since then. What those two people did for me back there in Earlville was to let me believe in my own creativity and give me permission to look at the world a little differently and to describe things the way I saw them instead of the way other people want them to be.
And what a simpler time it was when the biggest controversy in school that required a parent-teacher meeting was the choice of color of a cow.
Well, it was a much simpler time. I sometimes regret that I didn't grow up in the city, because city I would have had access to a lot of things that I didn't have access to in Earlville. But I never regret having grown up in a town where people didn't even lock their doors. I mean, I never even had a key to the door because we never locked the door. Everybody in town knew my name. I knew the name of everybody in town. It was just a simpler lifestyle, and an altogether great way for a kid to grow up.
And this actually goes into my next question. Since you did mention you wanted to maybe grow up in the city, what was it that made you feel sometimes that you would have been boxed in growing up in Earlville?
Yeah, the things that I kind of missed by growing up in Earlville were a lot of cultural things. I never grew to have an appreciation for like dance, ballet. It took me not until I grew up and was an adult did I ever learn to appreciate ballet. Classical music, same thing. Never learned to appreciate it until I was grown up. My mother used to have regular trips into the city, into Chicago, because her mother lived in Cicero. We got in, and every time we'd go in, she'd make sure to take me someplace like cultural, like the Museum of Science and Industry, Field Museum, the Art Institute, one of those big theaters downtown, the State and Lake, where they had stage shows and all that kind of stuff, where I saw Harry Houdini make an elephant disappear. The thing I missed growing up in a small town, more than anything else, was the fact that there weren't a lot of other kids. The high school at Earlville at the time, the entire school had a student population of 100. There were 25 kids in my class, and most of those kids lived on farms. So I really grew up all by myself. I didn't have anybody to play with because there were no kids in town, which was bad for me, but kind of good for me because it really forced me to make my own fun and use my imagination.
Now, you already mentioned that the Blue Cow experience was a moment of where your creativity may have gotten you into hot water. Any other times when your creativity as a kid could have gotten you into a little bit of trouble?
That's an interesting question. With the Blue Cow, with the Blue Cow experience firmly in my mind, the next year, one of my teachers asked us to write what we did on our summer vacation. I wrote this, I think, brilliant 5-page story about how I got into a rocket ship and went to the moon. I turned it in, and of course, by now the Blue Cow story had made the rounds of all the teachers at Earlville, and this time at least my mother didn't have to go to school, but but teacher gave me back my grade with a C+, saying, well, I don't think you really did this, but I'll give you a C+ for originality. It's kind of interesting because in later years when I went to the University of Illinois, I was going to be an electrical engineer because we had Marathon Electric in Earlville, and the electrical engineers were the high-status people in Earlville in those days. So I decided I was going to be an electrical engineer. So I went to the University of Illinois in the engineering school, and I spent my first year in engineering. In those days, English was a flunk-out course. I look at today how the trouble kids have getting into college, even state schools like the University of Illinois. In those days, if you graduated from any accredited Illinois high school, they couldn't turn you down. I mean, they had to take you, but they would flunk you out. The first year, and English was one of the flunk-out courses. I was just swamped with my engineering studies. I had this assignment in my English class, and it was to do a book report on the Odyssey. Well, I'd read the Odyssey years before. I didn't want to do just a straight book report, so instead of doing a book report, I rewrote the Odyssey as a piece of noir detective fiction and turned it in. And, once again, history repeats itself. Once again, the instructor passed back all of the papers except mine and said, Gary, come up and see me after class. I went up and saw him, and he gave me back my paper, and he had given me an F. And he said, look, I honestly have to flunk you for this because you didn't do the assignment, but you are obviously a very talented writer and you don't need this class, and I know that you're really swamped with your engineering work, so I'm just going to give you an A in proficiency out, and you don't have to come to class anymore. I thought, oh, thank you, Lord, because I've got so much engineering work that I just don't want to mess around with this English stuff and writing. I kind of wish that he had failed me and made me stay in that class because I might have, written Roger Rabbit a year or two earlier.
Now, at Earlville, there was the FFA, there was sports, and you were involved in some of those, and all sorts of clubs to be involved in. But I understand that you chose to honor a certain Disney duck with a special club?
Oh, the Scrooge McDuck Club, yes. John Myers, who probably a lot of your listeners know and remember, who went on to become the Archbishop of Newark, one of my dearest, oldest, and closest friends. He and I read a lot of comic books together. One of the comics that we read, and one of our favorite characters, was Scrooge McDuck. We started the Scrooge McDuck fan club. We didn't have any money to throw into a bin that we could swim through, but we were able to collect two things: string and tinfoil. And you got tinfoil didn't come in rolls like it does today. It came on the back of like pieces of bubble gum. peel the tinfoil off and make a ball out of it. We made string balls and we made tinfoil balls. And we vowed that we would continue to do it our whole life, and that in later life we would get together and see whose balls were bigger. And we have not officially done that, but I got to tell you, I got pretty big balls.
So a Scrooge McDuck Club, it's kind of, I don't want to say ironic, but it's certainly interesting that Duck and money and everything else and Disney was an early influence in your life, which kind of ties into stuff later on.
Yeah, absolutely. When I wrote Who Censored Roger Rabbit, I wanted Roger to be a character that would kind of have the morality of Mickey Mouse, who would always, promise you he was going to do something and then he would do it, and also the kind of anti-morality of Bugs Bunny, who would promise you he was going to do something and then put a dynamite stick down the front of your pants. So I wanted a character like that, and I wanted to create characters that could be Disney characters. Even though when I wrote the book, I wrote the book to be the best possible book I could write. And I think you get in a big trouble if you write a book saying, well, it's going to be a movie. You're going to have to make compromises, because a book is a book and a movie is a movie. A book is something that forces a reader to use his or her imagination, and a movie just lays it right out there in front of you for you all to see, and you don't have to use your imagination as much. So I wrote it as a book and never really expected that it would become a movie, because I actually thought it was unfilmable. I did not think there was any way that you could take this book and turn it into a movie. There were just too many strange conventions to it. I had the characters, instead of talking, they were actually characters from cartoon strips and comic books. And instead of talking in words verbally, they spoke in word balloons. So every time they would talk, a word balloon would go up, and whoever they were talking to would have to read their word balloon. And if you had a tuned gun and shot somebody with a tuned gun, the tuned gun would produce a word balloon, and you could analyze that word balloon and tell the caliber of the gun and the make and the model. If somebody's playing a piano, the notes go up into strings of notes, and then you collect those strings of notes and you cut them into 8x12 sheets, and that's where sheet music comes from. That was a convention, one of the many that I came up with for the book, that just made it unfilmable.
And so did it start as more of a science fiction thought exercise for you, maybe? Because as a way to explore, like, what if comic strips were alive? Did you approach it that way and then it turned into a book? Or did you start from the beginning with, this is the idea for the book? No, I had written 3 novels at the time. I always want to push the envelope. I always want to try and do things that have never been done before. I was looking for the concept for my 4th novel. I had 2 big loves. I had, once again, going back to Earlville. My father ran the pool hall in Earlville for years and years. He and his brother ran the pool hall barbershop. And my mother told me, if you want to get out of Earlville, if you don't want to wind up living here your whole life and running your dad's pool hall, the one thing you can do to make that happen is to read. That's what's going to get you out of Earlville. Great mother that she was, she never put any restrictions on what I read. So, what do I read? I read comic books, almost nothing else for years and years. So I had this great enduring love of comic books. I had this great enduring love of comic strips, because my dad, every day when I was too young to read myself, would sit me down and read me the comic strips from the newspaper. But I also had a love for another one of my dad's reading pleasures, which were graphically illustrated true crime magazines, which I guess you would probably equate with like a reality crime TV show today. They showed graphic images of horrible murders and bank robberies, all kinds of stuff like that. But I loved them, and luckily I graduated to good noir mysteries like Raymond Chandler and Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe. So I had 2 loves. I had noir, private eye mysteries, and comic books and comic strips. And I was trying to figure out how I could do something that would interrelate those 2. And then one day I was watching Saturday morning cartoons for research. I told my wife, just for research. I'm watching these. And I became fascinated
not by the cartoons, which I thought were pretty simplistic, but by the commercials, because I saw the Trix Rabbit, Captain Crunch, Snap, Crackle, and Pop, Tony the Tiger, who were cartoon characters, and they were talking to real kids, and nobody seemed to think that was odd. That's where the light bulb went on. I thought to myself, wow, what an interesting premise it would be if you had a world where cartoon characters were real. That would be really interesting. And so I spent almost a year researching the conventions of comic strips, cartoons, and comic books to see how the characters there differed from the characters in real life, and then translating that into a real-world environment. Then I came up with the mystery, added Eddie Valiant, a hard-boiled private eye extraordinaire. That was how it came to be.
Now, comic books, they've gone from, being scoffed at as a business, because for a long time, comic books were just sort of, well, it's a kid's thing, and they were just, discarded. And now they've turned into the driving force of arts and culture, because you look at the biggest grossing movies that are out right now, they're based on comic books.
Sure, Marvel. Sure, went to a lecture and had dinner with Art Spiegelman, who did Mouse, won the Pulitzer Prize for Mouse.
I remember that one. That's a fantastic graphic novel.
Fantastic. And he and I have a similar love of the old style comic books. And what happened was, when I was growing up, there was really no limit on what you could do in a comic book. And so they got pretty graphic. Not as graphic as comic books are today, or certainly pushing the boundaries of PG-13 to R if you're going to read a comic book. And they had horror comic books that were really horrible. One of them I read sitting alone in my bedroom on the second floor of our house, and it gave me nightmares for months, and it still gives me nightmares. There came a time when the Senate got involved, as the Senate usually does with everything that's fun in life, and said, these comic books are perverting our youth. And they had the Senate committee on perverting the youth of America. I don't know. But what they wound up doing was coming up with a comics code. I think the industry itself came up with the comics code. Prohibited comic books from doing graphic violence. And that's where comic books like Archie and the Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, Uncle Scrooge comics came in, because they were safe for children. It took years and years and years before people started to realize that, well, maybe comic books weren't what was perverting the youth of America. Started loosening up, and then you started getting comics like Mad Magazine, and comics were kind of rebranded as graphic novels. And now they're a viable piece of literature. I mean, there are college courses on graphic novel.
Do you still read new comic books now?
I do. Not as much as I used to. Most of my reading now is, I still read a lot of crime fiction because I like it. I read a lot of bestsellers just to kind of stay current with what's going on in the market. And the thing that I now kind of don't like about reading in general is that instead of having to actually get the comic book and go down to the B Street smoke shop and spend my quarter, I can now just get it, download it, and read it on my Kindle. Same with novels, and I miss the tactile sensation of it. But yeah, I still read comic books, not as much or as often as I used to, or as much or as often as I'd like.
Now, your early influences were science fiction, and you read a lot, obviously. Science fiction selections were probably limited at Earlville Library and Earlville School, I'm sure. But what was the first science fiction universe you really got yourself absorbed in as a kid?
Well, there's no question about that one. As I say, me and John Myers, who is now the Catholic Archbishop of New Jersey, were great friends in Earlville. Our mothers were pregnant at the same time, and we grew up playing together, and we've always been friends. We were both big readers. John would read mostly biographies, even at early age, and I was reading mostly adventure stories like King Arthur and Robin Hood, and the occasional mystery story. We both really liked science. We were both really interested in science. So one day, John came to me with this book, and he said, "You've got to read this book." He said, "It's science, but it's fiction. It's science fiction." And I had never heard of that before, neither had he. So he gave it to me, and that book was called Space Hawk. I read it, and I was enthralled by this book. I mean, this book was incredible. John and I went to the librarian at the Earlville Public Library and said, "Can you get us more of this science fiction?" And by now we were known as the little boys who preferred to to sit in their rooms and read rather than go outside and play. So, and the librarian was more than willing to, foster our reading. And so she brought us in all the giants. She brought us in Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury and, all of the biggies. We both kept reading science fiction. And John, to this day, can quote you chapter and verse of any Star Trek episode that's ever aired. Still knows more about science fiction than the average guy. So, years go by, and it was probably 30 years later. And I wanted to get John a Christmas present. So I decided that I was going to buy 2 copies of Space Hawk and give one to John and one to me, and then we could both reread it and relive our youth. And I got to tell you, the two of us in our conversations could quote passages verbatim from Space Hawk. Hawk Karst raised his laser blaster, pulled the trigger, and blew a hole through the forehead of evil, merciless Ming, and the air was filled with the smoke of singed flesh. I mean, we can quote that stuff. And so I got a copy for me and a copy for John, and I read it. It's the worst damn book you've ever read in your life. It was horrible. It was horrible. It was clumsily written. The hero, Hawk Karst, was a cardboard yahoo. It was semi-racist. It was horrible. And I'm thinking to myself, this was the biggest influence on my life when I was a kid. I mean, it's a straight line from Space Hawk to Roger Rabbit. I mean, how could this happen? So I called John, and I said to John, did you read it? And he said, yeah. I said, what'd you think? He said, well, it wasn't very good. He said, yeah, you can say that again. So one of us, and we still argue over which one, but one of us said, it's a shame that we can't rewrite this the way we remember it instead of the way it actually was. So basically, we spent a couple of years and rewrote it. You couldn't rewrite it. I mean, it was too bad. It was unsalvageable. But we came up with a new story that's much, much better. We did leave a few of the character names and a few of the purple prose passages, like the air was full of the smell of singed flesh. Couldn't pass upon that. But we published it as a book called Space Vulture. It's done very well. The New York Times did an article on the 10 pulp science fiction novels that you must have in your collection. And it's Asimov, Bradbury, and Wolf and Myers. Space Vulture makes the list.
Now, it's been 40-some years or more since you began your love of science fiction. Are you disappointed with the lack of Art Deco architecture and glass bubble houses?
Everybody always says, well, how come we don't have the flying cars? Where are the flying cars? I think it's called speculative fiction for a reason. People speculate on what life is going to be like, and sometimes life goes in one direction and not the other. Yeah, we don't have flying cars, but I don't remember any of the science fiction of my day and age talking about the internet or the iPhone, which I think I'd rather have than a flying car. Can't crash my iPhone, although I guess if I play Pokemon Go, I guess I can crash into the corner of a building someplace. I think that science fiction is really interesting because the people who are writing it are of the moment and are projecting what they think the future is going to be like. And I think it's really interesting to occasionally go back and see where they were right and where they were wrong. My first novel, Killer Bowl, I did indeed predict, and that was 1976, and I did indeed predict the internet. I predicted what you would now call an iPhone. Probably most impressive, I predicted what you would now call the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. So, I also predicted the gas crisis. So sometimes you hit and sometimes you miss. Art Deco, we don't have the Art Deco houses, but I can go to Miami Beach and, see all the Art Deco and supermodels besides. So
it was almost with science fiction and a lot of it's been, I guess, in my mind, more of a recent phenomenon because old science fiction, in my mind, has always had this antiseptic view of the future of clean, glimmering streets and no problems except for the marauding alien force.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that was the pulp universe, and that's what Space Vulture addresses. I was always more interested in the social and the social engineering aspects of the future in science fiction. So Roger Rabbit, if by any stretch of the imagination you want to call Roger Rabbit science fiction instead of science fantasy or just flat out fantasy, Roger Rabbit addresses social issues more than science issues. The Toons are basically the immigrants, the people that don't fit in. They're not better than humans. They're not worse. They're just different. Kind of the whole premise of Roger Rabbit is, hey, we got to learn to live with our differences and just get along.
Now, you said you did your first book in 1976.
Yeah.
At what point did you realize I am an author?
Oh, that was before that. That was a science fiction short story I wrote. I used to write poetry for my wife. She said, oh, your poems are so nice. She says, you should try writing a story. Spent a year and wrote a short story, and it was 50 pages long. It was called Love Story. It actually came out in print just the same time as Eric Siegel's book, Love Story, so everybody accused me of ripping off his title. But believe me, I wrote the short story before. It was 50 pages, and I sent it off to a science fiction publication, and I never heard. And I thought, well, that must be the way it is. It probably wound up in a wastebasket somewhere. So I started writing a different short story, and after maybe 6 months, I get this telegram saying, we want to publish your short story, and if you agree, wire us back, and we'll give you $50. $1 a page is what they were paying then. I think it's gone up to $1.10 now. But I was as happy with that $50 as I was with any mega $1 million sale that I've made since. I was dancing on the kitchen table, and when the check came, I cashed the check, and I went off. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and it was the 70s. So I went off to San Francisco to Haight Street to buy some authorly clothes. And if you were on Haight Street in the 70s, you can imagine what I came back with. I got a custom-made pair of leather pants, which I am proud to say I can still wear, although they are bell-bottoms. And the bells are like 18 inches across. So I got myself a tweed jacket with leather sleeves and a black turtleneck, and I felt that I looked like an author. The whole thing cost me like $300. So my first story wound up as a net loss of $250. So.
Now, talking with Gary K. Wolf of Earlville, who wrote the book Who Censored Roger Rabbit, which was turned into a major motion picture, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. When did you first discover there was interest in turning your book into a movie?
I wrote the book, and I had never in my life gotten a reject. I had never had a reject on a short story, never had a reject on a novel. I had written 3 novels for Doubleday. Every time I wrote a novel, they would accept the novel and send me a contract for a new novel, subject matter, whatever I wanted to write about, and they would have sent it to them, and they would publish it and send me another contract. So I wrote Roger Rabbit and sent it to them, and this was the book that was going to fulfill my contract for my 4th novel. And for the first time ever, they rejected it. I was devastated. I couldn't understand it. I called my editor and I said, Mary, what's going on here? This is clearly the best thing I've ever written. And she said, yeah, I agree. It's funny, it's witty. I've never seen anything like this. Totally unique. But it's so different from anything you've written, so different from anything Doubleday Science Fiction has ever published, that I had to send it to the marketing department. And it was the marketing department who rejected it. So I called the head of the marketing department. I said, hey, Chuck, what's going on? Why did you reject my novel? And he said, well, I got to be honest with you. He said, it doesn't fit into any category. There's no category for this on a bookstore shelf. It's not fiction. It's not a children's book. It's not a regular mystery. There's no category for it. I can't sell this. And I said, all right, let me ask you, what would you do if somebody brought you The Wizard of Oz or Alice in Wonderland or Gulliver's Travels? What would you do with those? And he thought about it for me, and he says, I couldn't sell those either. So I said, well, I went to my agent. I said, Bill, what do I do here? And he said, well, don't worry about it. We will sell this. And I said, if you can't sell it, it's clearly my best work. It's clearly something I want to do. It's clearly something I did well. If you can't sell it, I don't want to be a writer anymore because there's going to be no future for me. So he said, no, don't worry about it. We'll sell it. So he started sending it out to different publishers and sometimes to different editors at the same publisher. And over the course of sending it out, it got 110 rejects. 110 rejects. I used to call it the daily disappointments. I'd come back and check my mail, and there'd be another reject from some other publisher. Till finally, and always for the same reason. I mean, the editors loved it. They sent it to the marketing department. The marketing department says, we can't sell this. So finally, it landed on the desk of a woman named Rebecca Martin at St. Martin's Press. And Rebecca had just published a big major bestseller for them. And so they gave her a vanity project. They said, the next book that you publish, you can publish whatever you want, and we'll publish it. So my book came across her desk, and she looked at it and said, this is what I want to publish. So she took it to the president of St. Martin's and said, this is the book I want to publish for my vanity project. And he said, he read it and got back to her and said, well, I told you could publish any book you wanted, but you can't publish this. I'm not going to publish it. I can't sell it. And Rebecca stepped up to the plate and said, publish it or I quit. And so they published it, albeit in very, very small quantities. And I wish I had bought all of those hardbacks that they published in those days, because if you go on eBay now, they sell for $350. And so anyway, it was scheduled to come out. That was 1980. It was scheduled to come out in 1981. That's the publishing lead time in those days. Well, I get this call. And, some guy says to me, is this Gary Wolf? I said, yeah. He says, hi, this is Roy Disney, the Disney Corporation. Yeah, right. Who is this really? He says, no, this is Roy Disney, and I just read your Roger Rabbit book, and I want to know if you'd be interested in selling the rights to the Disney people and letting us make a movie. Well, the book hadn't come out yet. So, I obviously, I don't, how did you get this? It turned out that someone at St. Martin's Press had sent a copy of the manuscript to Disney with a note saying, we think you'd be interested in this. And I never found out who did it, because I desperately wanted to kiss him or her full on the lips. I never found out who did it, but somebody did it, and it made its way to Roy Disney. And Roy Disney read it and said, yeah, this would be a great movie for the Disney company, and called me and bought the rights.
Was there any hesitation with turning them loose with the characters you created?
Well, again, you have to go back to my initial belief that I didn't think this could be a movie. I'm an author. I now write movies myself, but in those days I was just an author, and I'd been to a ton of movies, but I'd never written one, and I just didn't see how they could turn my book into a movie. And in the beginning, they kind of proved me right. Disney wanted Roger Rabbit for a couple of reasons. First of all, they were in danger of becoming a third-rate movie production company. They had done The Nutty Professor and Flubber and the Black Cauldron and The Black Hole, and all of those movies that disappeared down the black hole. They had been offered E.T. and they passed. They'd been offered Star Wars and they passed. They needed something that was going to reestablish them as kind of preeminent in the field of movie making, and they saw Roger Rabbit as being that. Well, in the beginning, they kind of proved me right. They really didn't have the horsepower to do this movie in any way, shape, or form, let alone do it right. They tried all kinds of techniques to get live action and animation blended on the screen. They didn't have any success with that. Finally, one day, Roy Disney came to me and said, what would you think if instead of doing this as a movie with live actors and animated characters, we did them all live action and just had the characters wear costumes like they do at Disneyland? And I'm thinking to myself, oh man, I'm going to get Haley Mills as Jessica. I'm going to get Fred McMurray as Eddie Valiant and Dean Jones as the Rabbit. And I told him, I said, don't you think that kind of compromises the premise just a little bit? So, cooler heads prevailed, and they went away. They kept trying. Probably, maybe never would have succeeded, except that at one point they had an upheaval at Disney. Roy Disney was out, and a guy named Michael Eisner came in, and he brought with him Jeff Katzenberg. Eisner and Katzenberg had worked together at 20th Century with a guy you might have heard of called Steve Spielberg. And they called Steve and said, hey, we've got this movie over here. Would you come over to Disney and produce it for us? And Steve had actually read the book when it came out and said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. So he came over, and to show you the difference that Steve Spielberg makes in Hollywood, back in 1981, Roy Disney went to Warner Brothers and said to them, we're making this live-action animated movie, and I'd like to get Bugs Bunny to come on screen and just do a cameo. He's going to come on screen, he's going to say, "What's up, Doc?" and then walk off. And Warner Brothers said, "Get lost. No way are we going to let Bugs Bunny be in a Walt Disney movie." 5 years later, Steve Spielberg makes the identical request. He goes to Warner Brothers and said, "We're making this movie. Can we have Bugs Bunny for a cameo?" I said, Of course. But what about Porky Pig? Don't you want him? And the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote and Yosemite Sam, the Tweety Bird and Putty Cat. You got to have them all. So he got them all for a minimal fee. I mean, so ridiculously minimal that I could have probably paid for it myself out of my paper route delivery money. The only restriction was that Bugs Bunny, being a superstar, had a contract. It's like superstars in Hollywood do. And in his contract, it specified that you could not have Mickey Mouse on screen without Bugs. The two had to be on screen at the same time simultaneously. And they had to have the exact same number of words of dialogue. And you can go through the DVD and check it for yourself and listen and count the words. And they say the same exact number of words, and they're on screen for the exact same amount of time.
After the success of the Who Framed Roger Rabbit motion picture, it totally changed how you approached writing books from then on, right? I mean, you saw, I guess, as a reference to Cartoon Universe, I mean, you kind of had that carrot dangling out in front of you now that this is a path to success. Did it change things for you?
Well, it kind of didn't. It kind of didn't. When Roger Rabbit came out, Roger Rabbit, the Who Framed Roger Rabbit, was a resounding success. Most critically acclaimed movie of 1988. I won 4 Academy Awards with that movie. Got a screenwriting deal with Disney. I wrote the sequel novel, Who Plugged Roger Rabbit, and we standardized on the 4-piece stutter. And my agent had 10 publishers bidding on that novel. Now, of those 10 publishers, every single one of them had rejected the original novel once. 3 of them had rejected the original novel twice, and 1 of them had rejected the original novel 3 times. And now they're all bidding on the right to publish the second novel. Disney bought the movie rights to that one immediately. It may or may not be the second Roger Rabbit movie. The problem it gave me was, if you read the novel, and I encourage you to read the novel. So far, I think it's just maybe you, my mother, and a couple of my aunts have read it.
And Spielberg.
And Spielberg read it too, yeah. So there's 4. There's the 4 of you. But the novel is considerably different in tone and in story from the movie. The movie is more family friendly, not as dark. I think they're both valid. They're both valid premises, and they're both valid executions of the concept. The thing that I'm happiest with is that Disney kept my concept of a world where cartoon characters are real, and they kept the characters. I mean, they could have made this thing with Bucky Badger and Haley instead of Jessica.
And your book had a sort of different sort of closure, I guess you want to put it that way.
The book had a different closure, and put your hands over your ears if you don't want to hear this. But in the end of the book, the rabbit dies. I knew immediately that this was going to change in the movie, because one of the reasons why Disney wanted this book and wanted to make the movie was because Disney makes a tremendous amount of money selling merchandise, raincoats and lunch bags and all kinds of stuff. And you're not going to sell many kids a doll of a dead rabbit. So I knew that was going to change. I didn't resent that. But what was a problem for me was doing the sequel novel. Do I do the sequel novel more like the movie, or do I stick to the premise of my book? So I came up with a kind of a hybrid. I kept the word balloons because I love the word balloons. Although now in the second book, the cartoon characters also have the ability to talk. I had to kind of resurrect Roger. I figured out a way to do that. And so the second book is kind of a hybrid for me. I eventually did the third Roger Rabbit novel, just came out about 2 years ago, called Who Whacked Roger Rabbit. On that one, I went more toward the original source material. And Who Whacked Roger Rabbit is a lot darker than Who Plugged Roger Rabbit was. All 3 are, equally valid, equally good. But it gave me some creative problems. Like I say, there's the 4 of us who have read the book. at last count, 2 gazillion people have seen the movie. You know, the movie has grossed more than $1 billion worldwide. And that's a lot of tickets and a lot of people. So to most people, their concept of Roger Rabbit is the movie Roger Rabbit, not the book Roger Rabbit. I had to satisfy those people while at the same time being true to my own creativity and my own instinct. My blue cow. I didn't want to color that cow green just because that was the color of the money I was going to make by selling it to the movies. I wanted to be true to my creativity, and I think I was.
Now, in literature, is the Roger Rabbit story finally over, or is there still more to come?
You know, it's hard to tell. Right now, I'm working on a movie that I think will make Roger Rabbit fans very happy. More than that, I cannot say. Whether or not I'm going to revisit that universe, I don't know. And I never really anticipated doing the sequel novel Plugged, and I really wasn't going to do the third novel at all. I had outlined it and mostly written it and then put it away because my agent told me, let's wait to sell this until they come up with a second movie, and then we can sell it for more money. So I put it in my drawer and left it there, and of course, you know, we're still waiting for the second movie. I got a new publisher, and they were publishing my book, The Late Great Show, which just came out in a new revised edition. You can get it on Amazon.com. They wanted me to do a blog, and they said, you know, what do you have that you could put on a blog that would keep people coming back every day? And I said, oh, well, I got this Roger Rabbit novel that I wrote but never published, and I could, you know, maybe do a chapter of that every day. And the publisher said, you've got a third Roger Rabbit novel that you've never published? And I said, well, yeah. And she said, well, why don't we just publish that instead of doing it on the blog? So that's really how that came about. I probably never would have published a third Roger Rabbit novel. And whether or not I go back and revisit that world again, I don't know. It's one of the most time-consuming and grueling writing processes that I've ever done, because in order to write about Toontown, you have to go live there. You have to immerse yourself in Toontown, and you surround yourself with tunes and tune concepts, and you have to think about everything the way you would think about it if you were in a world where cartoon characters are real. Like if you go into a bar, is it a human bar or a toon bar? And if it's a toon bar, well, and you're a human, what do you drink? I mean, do you drink Toon Tonic, which is what toons drink? And, you know, if you do, what's that going to do to you? And if you tune it, you're going to a human bar, and you drink human liquor, what's that going to do to you? Well, I think we saw that in the movie, but every single thing is that. You have to think about it. I don't know if I've got that in me.
It's almost a burden, I guess, in your case, because writing a book for yourself is one thing, because you can go ahead and in your mind justify taking the story to a certain place, but for the fans, they're looking at it as the universe that they've imagined and they've loved, and it's almost like a level of trust between you and the readers.
Yeah, I guess I'm fortunate in that I don't write for the fans. I write to amuse myself. You know, I write because it's a solitary endeavor, and I sit here in my office and I do my 50 pages a day or whatever, and I make myself laugh. And if I can do that, then it's a good day for me. I'm kind of fortunate in that what I do to make myself laugh makes other people laugh too. That's really the relationship with the fans. I don't write to please anybody but myself, but I'm kind of fortunate that what I do write to please myself seems to please everybody else too.
How is the relationship with Disney right now?
Oh, it's pretty good. You know, when I wrote that, I was always regarded. I would go down to Orlando to the animation department, and I was on the movie set, and I would go to the animation department in London, and I was always treated like, you know, like they would treat Moses coming down from the mountain with, you know, the two stone tablets on which are writ large the words Roger Rabbit. I mean, they valued me. They valued my creativity. They asked me a lot of questions about gags and structure and scenes and stuff like that, and they always took my advice. You know, I had a good relationship with Disney, still do. The problem now is that Disney has other characters and other franchises, if you will, that are very lucrative for them, that they're putting a lot of their resources and their money into, like, you know, the Marvel characters and the Star Wars characters, and really the whole string of Pixar characters. You know, my relationship with them is very good. they gave me 2 lifetime passes to Disneyland as part of the deal for the Roger Rabbit movie, and I still have them, and I still use them to go to Disneyland. They don't shoot me at the gate.
Talking with Gary K. Wolf, growing up in Earlville native, wrote Who Censored Roger Rabbit, which turned into a major motion picture that you may have heard of, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Of course, one of the biggest hits of the late 80s, groundbreaking technology involved in the movies, and you have a website.
I do. www.garywolf.com. You can learn all about everything that I haven't talked about here today. You can also go to www.spacevulture.com, and you will get the entire story about me and my relationship with John Myers and our book, Space Vulture.
And all your books can be found at various retailers and online places.
Yeah, the best place to get them now is Amazon.com. You can get them there in Kindle, you can get them there in paperback, and if you're a Prime member, you can buy it today and be reading it tomorrow.
Thank you very much for joining us this morning on Music and Stuff, and look forward to talking again soon. Maybe next time there's something big coming along, maybe you can give us the heads up and we'll talk about it then, all right?
Hey, my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Charles, thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.